Sometimes reality seems to push you in perfect circles. Same questions, same pains. The scenery changes, but the storyline remains. And have you noticed? Every time you try to change the world out there, something invisible inside holds you back, as if existence itself knows where you usually look and responds accordingly. Maybe reality isn't just happening, maybe it's listening to you. At the center of it, an almost imperceptible phenomenon, the observer's loop. A cycle where your gaze, filled with old beliefs and automatic gestures, constantly summons the same responses from the surrounding field. Reality, like a nervous mirror, reflects what you expect to see, not what is actually available. But what if the cycle can be broken? What if the simple act of seeing with different eyes, with presence, with direction, with wholeness, not only alters your perception, but literally provokes a different response from reality? Today, you will discover why reality changes the very moment you change the way you see it. You'll understand why certain events only happen when you stop waiting, and why consciousness is not just an observer, it is a creator. Stay until the end, because those who understand where the loop is formed also learn where it unravels, and those who break the cycle begin to live off script, ready to see and be seen differently. Nothing in the world is still. But there is something subtler than movement, the way everything responds. Reality is not a neutral stage, nor a passive backdrop waiting for you to act. It is alive, pulsing in tune with the exact point of your attention. Observing is not just recording, it is touching. It is interfering. The mere act of looking changes what is being looked at. Quantum physics has already noticed the presence of the observer modifies the behavior of the particle, but what it still whispers, almost in secret, is that this logic also applies to your emotional, energetic, and symbolic life. Do you look with fear? Reality contracts. Do you look with absence? The world closes. Do you look expecting pain? Pain appears, loyal like a dog. This is the beginning of the loop. Every observation carries an intention, even if unconscious, even if denied, and reality, as a responsive and subtle system, responds to that nonverbal gesture. It gives back what your gaze evokes. Like a forgotten language between the field and consciousness, where every look is a silent word creating the future. The problem is not in observing, but in the pattern guiding the gaze. What you see is, in part, a consequence of what you project when you look. Those who repeat the same way of observing recreate the same type of reality. And the more the world confirms what you expected, the more you believe it is fixed, predictable, and resistant to change. This is the point where the cycle solidifies. The observer thinks they are seeing the world as it is, but they're only seeing what their trained mind has learned to expect. Reality's response becomes a hypnotic repetition, not out of cruelty, but vibrational coherence. Like an instrument that only resonates with the exact frequency it receives, reality echoes your consciousness. And while the observer doesn't realize they are actively participating in creation, everything moves as if stuck. The same conflicts, the same reactions, the same results, recycled in new forms. The observer's loop is not a punishment, it is a reflection. But not every reflection reveals the real. Some merely return the image of what you have not yet questioned. The breaking of the cycle begins with a silent question. What am I seeing, and why am I seeing it this way? This question is not rational. It doesn't seek explanations, but openness. By questioning the very way of observing, something becomes misaligned in the pattern. A crack forms in the automatic circuit of perception, and it is there and in that gap between seeing and knowing that reality finds a chance to respond differently. The loop breaks when the observer stops reacting as they always have, when the gaze becomes presence, not judgment, when consciousness is whole, carrying neither past, future, nor the need to control. This change is subtle, but powerful, because it doesn't depend on changing the world. It depends on changing the way you stand before it. Reality is not punishing you. It is listening to you and responding perfectly to your way of seeing. The problem is that this way was inherited. Your gaze was taught to seek danger, validation, threat, or confirmation, and the world responded to this training with situations that only reinforced the conditioning. But in every breath, there is a point of choice. And every observer is, above all, a dormant creator. When the observer's loop is unconsciously maintained, reality repeats with almost mathematical rigor. But when this cycle is noticed and no longer fed, a different kind of response begins to emerge, subtle, unpredictable, and revealing. No longer an echo of the past, but a foreshadowing of the unknown. Reality is not a sentence, it is a responsive field, and you, even without knowing it, have always been one of its most powerful emitters. To see is not a neutral act. The gaze carries the memory of traumas, the expectation of desires, the tension of failures, and the fear that everything will happen the same way again. It is in this invisible landscape that the observer's loop grows stronger. An event occurs, a misunderstanding, a loss, an absence, and the mind registers not just the fact, but a narrative. This always happens to me. I knew it. Nothing ever changes. Over time, these phrases become filters. And the gaze, without realizing it, starts looking for evidence to support what it has already assumed to be true. Repetition, then, doesn't come from reality itself, but from how it is summoned by the consciousness that observes. It's not the world that insists on hurting you. It's the internal pattern that remains loyal to the learned storyline. With every new event, a judgment. With every new person, an old projection. With every choice, the echo of a decision made out of fear or lack. And life responds with precision, not as punishment but as confirmation. The cycle feeds itself. You look at the world through the eyes of someone expecting not to be chosen, and the world responds with distance. You observe abundance as something scarce, and everything seems to slip through your fingers. You prepare to be betrayed, and every gesture becomes suspect. The gaze shapes the field responds to the gaze, and the loop closes. Not because it's impossible to escape, but because few realize they are inside it. Unconscious repetition relies on a specific kind of blindness, the one that believes it is seeing everything. But what is seen, in this case, is only the reflection of what has already been decided internally. The observer doesn't notice that instead of perceiving reality, they are confirming what is already known. It's like watching the same movie every day, believing the world is made only of that script. And that script, more often than not, is ancestral. It was learned even before you understood language. It was inherited through vibration, not by choice. The way you were looked at largely defined the way you came to look. The expectations of others became your internal standard of expectation. And now, like a silent program, this operates in the background, organizing experiences, attracting patterns, repeating stories. But there's an essential detail. What is unconscious is not eternal. Just add light, and the cycle is exposed. The broken observer's loop begins with this realization. It's not reality that insists on repeating itself. It's your way of seeing that is still committed to the past. Looking with awareness is not about forcing positive thoughts. It's not about denying pain or manufacturing optimism. It's about recognizing what you have been placing into the field through your attention. It's about admitting that you've been expecting the worst, and the worst has been answering in kind. Repetition only ends when the observer stops the habit of seeking confirmation. When the gaze detaches from what was taught and begins to open to what is possible, even without guarantees. It's not simple. The mind wants to protect itself, and repeating is a form of safety. But awakened consciousness does not seek comfort, it seeks truth. And the truth is that every unconscious repetition hides an unmade choice. The choice to see differently, to feel differently, to respond differently. Until that happens, life remains a distorted mirror, not of what is, but of what you keep choosing to see. And that choice happens at every moment, with every thought you accept, with every emotion you feed, with every story you silently repeat. The observer's loop is not sustained by the external reality. It is maintained by internal loyalty to what has already been lived. But a single act of presence, a single moment without judgment, is enough to break the pattern, even if just for seconds. And in those seconds, something new presents itself. not as a miracle, but as a consequence of a field that for the first time wasn't imprisoned by the same kind of gaze. The cycle breaks where you dare to see differently. There is no other point of rupture. Some repetitions are so well disguised that they're mistaken for destiny. But the cycle only continues until the observer begins to feel the discomfort of seeing everything happen the same way, even though nothing is truly the same. The scenery changes, the faces too, but the feeling of return remains until something gets tired. Not out of fragility, but from vibrational exhaustion. And in that tiredness, an interval arises, an internal space where the old gaze loses strength. And it's at this point that the observer's loop begins to crack. The moment of the break isn't loud. It rarely comes with euphoria or certainty. It comes as a kind of silent lucidity. You realize you're about to react the old way, but you don't. You feel the urge but pull back. You observe but don't engage. You know what's coming but refuse to repeat it. This is the crack. This is where reality begins to reorganize. Because for the first time, the field doesn't find the same signature as always. You don't run. You don't attack. You don't beg. You don't explain yourself. You simply see. And by seeing with presence, you dismantle the script. Reality responds not only to the content of your observation, but to its vibrational quality. And when that quality changes, even if only for seconds, the field can no longer sustain the previous response. Like an intelligent system, it must update itself. That's when unexpected events arise, unlikely encounters, changes that defy statistics. Not because you forced anything, but because something in you ceased the effort of maintaining the familiar. The broken observer's loop is this: the collapse of the predictable response, the end of repetition as reflection, the beginning of a different kind of dialogue between you and the world. Some call it synchronicity, others call it a miracle. But at its core, it's simply life giving you something new because finally, you looked differently. Not with the eyes of fear or lack or the need for control, but with a whole gaze, without story, without defense, without agenda. And life, sensitive to this vibration, responds. It always has. But now it responds differently. You stop identifying with old characters, stop seeking the same emotion in different people, stop sustaining stories that no longer fit your skin. The cycle breaks when you allow the now to not resemble yesterday, when you don't require the new to repeat the old, when you don't contaminate the present with the need to confirm the past. This is the most revolutionary act of all, to see without wanting to repeat. But attention, this break isn't sustained by intention alone. It requires constant presence, because old patterns, even when discredited, still try to return. They approach with familiar faces, seductive situations, disguised promises. It's up to the observer to remain lucid, not cold, but awake. And what's experienced after the break is something that cannot be explained logically. It's a reality that seems to hear you before you say anything, that anticipates your steps with answers you didn't even know you needed. That dissolves resistance with events that weren't planned. You begin to live less like someone pushing life and more like someone dancing with it. And this dance only begins when you stop leading from pain. Now it's up to you. If some part of you has already felt this breaking moment, this sudden interruption of the known cycle, write in the comments, "I saw differently." This simple gesture is like leaving a vibrational trail for those trying to escape their own maze. And if this content is opening clearings in your consciousness, like the video, this subtle support keeps the channel alive and the message in motion. The breaking of the loop doesn't happen only in the event. It takes root in the direction of the consciousness that sustains it. After the silence that dismantles the cycle, something begins to reorganize. Consciousness, free from the bonds of repetition, realizes that it's not enough to break a pattern, it's necessary to sustain a different field of perception. And here arises the silent question that transforms everything. From where am I seeing? Because seeing the world with a sleeping mind is different from seeing with awakened presence. The sleeping mind looks at the world through reflections. It observes through old references, traumas, comparisons, unfulfilled desires, needs disguised as goals. It doesn't see what's right in front of its eyes. It projects, anticipating pain, interpreting signs, searching for what it fears or desires. With each look, it tries to protect itself from something that has already passed, or to reach something that hasn't yet arrived. And reality responds. Like a code that recognizes the hidden command, the field returns situations that echo exactly that point of origin: fear, absence, the compulsion for control. The sleeping mind doesn't know it is creating. It believes it's only perceiving, but everything it perceives is already tinted by the quality of the observer it insists on being. It doesn't ask, "What is this?" It hurries to decide what that means. And by deciding, it closes the possibility of new responses. The awakened consciousness sees differently, not because it knows more, but because it holds less noise. It doesn't seek confirmation. It doesn't demand security. It doesn't try to predict, it simply witnesses. To witness is different from analyzing. It's different from reacting. It's different from understanding. To witness is to let the world reveal itself, without the need to translate everything into known language. It is this kind of presence that definitively breaks the observer's loop. Because repetition cannot survive a gaze without urgency. The field cannot return to the old script in front of a consciousness that does not feed it. The awakened gaze is a sun at the center of perception. Everything it touches, it transforms, not by force, but through clarity. And that clarity changes your relationship with what arises. What was once interpreted as threat now appears as raw energy. What seemed like a blockage now appears as redirection. What showed up as absence now is recognized as fertile space. Reality doesn't just change in content, it changes in tone. People still exist, challenges continue to arise, but the way you observe them no longer repeats the old pattern. And that's what changes everything. Reality no longer needs to repeat the previous script, because the protagonist has changed the way they see. The sleeping mind seeks explanation. The awakened consciousness offers space. And it's in that space that reality begins to respond to you with more fluidity, more synchronicity, more coherence with what you truly vibrate, and not just with what you fear or desire. The direction of consciousness is everything. You can look at the same event from two different internal places and receive opposite responses from life. In the first, you react. In the second, you witness. In the first, you reinforce the pattern. In the second, you break the cycle. In the first, the world seems to close. In the second, it begins to open, even though nothing objectively has changed. The broken observer's loop is this point where the gaze stops demanding and starts allowing. To allow is the most active state of conscious creation, because it doesn't come from passivity, but from trust. You're no longer trying to capture reality with formulas. You're dancing with it, moment by moment, without controlling the steps. And it's in this state of lucid trust that the new truly finds space to happen. Not because you did everything right, but because you finally got out of the way. The sleeping mind wants proof before trusting. The awakened consciousness trusts so that the proof can emerge. And in that subtle difference, an entirely new reality begins to take shape. The direction of consciousness changes everything, but it needs to be sustained, cultivated as if it were fertile soil. Once the automatic cycle is broken, the opportunity arises to consciously create the new landscape of reality. To observe consciously is more than paying attention. It is to be whole without anticipating, without concluding, without retreating to what is familiar. It is to look as if it were the first time, even at what you already know. As if the world owed nothing to your past, and the now were an unmapped field, ready to respond to what you vibrate, not just to what you remember. This state is not emotional, nor is it theoretical. It is vibrational. You know you are observing consciously when something inside you becomes silent, but does not disappear. A silence that does not flee, does not hide, does not seek the end of the experience, but sustains the experience until the end. The conscious observer is not neutral, but is also not needy. They look without needing reality to validate them, and because of that, they transform the way it presents itself. The practice begins before major events, before decisive encounters or significant choices. It begins in the smallest intervals, in the act of opening your eyes in the morning, in the contact with the first emotion of the day, in the moment you feel the urge to repeat an old reaction. It is in these almost invisible points that the new reality is built. To look with consciousness is to stop treating the present as an extension of what has already been. It is to interrupt the automatism of interpreting everything through the lens of what once hurt. It is to allow each experience to have its chance to be new, even if it carries traces of the old. Repetition only survives when the observer acts as a guardian of the past. But by becoming presence, without judgment, without anxiety, the new begins to manifest, not as an isolated event, but as a frequency of life. And that frequency requires practice. Not a tense, forced practice based on constant vigilance, but a gentle practice like someone tuning an instrument so the right note can finally sound. This tuning happens through small exercises of internal rupture. The first of them, perceive without interfering. You can start with a simple gesture. Look someone in the eyes and don't try to interpret. Just see, feel, be. Or even when facing emotional discomfort, choose not to run, not to react, not to label, but to be there, fully, until the emotion transforms without effort. Another exercise is to notice the moment your mind starts narrating, justifying, or fearing, and make a silent invitation to the body. Stay. Don't flee the sensation. Don't complete the sentence. Just feel and see what the field returns. The practice of conscious observation is less about technique and more about vibrational willingness. It is the choice not to speed up time, not to pressure reality, not to treat every movement of life as a threat or a test. In this state, even the most ordinary situations, a line, a casual conversation, a delay, can become portals of expansion. Because consciousness is no longer trying to escape anything, it is using everything as raw material for awakening. The broken observer's loop doesn't close again when there is enough presence to sustain the new gaze. But this presence needs to be renewed at every moment. Not as obligation, but as spiritual breathing. It's as if reality were always asking, are you really here, or did you bring the past to see for you? And each time you answer with wholeness, it responds with a different scenario. This is the most subtle and most radical invitation, to let reality happen without prior interference, to see with clear eyes, to feel without the need for conclusion. In this state, the field begins to conspire with you, not as magic, but as vibrational coherence. It's not about controlling life, but about attuning yourself to it. And tuning only happens where there is listening, not of the mind, but of the consciousness that sees, without hurry, without fear, without interruption. To observe is to create. That is the secret that has always been at the bottom of your own gaze. Reality does not respond to the thought that screams, but to the state that vibrates. That's why it's not enough to wish. It's necessary to sustain a new frequency of perception. And it only settles where judgment ceases, where the past no longer dictates what the now can be. The old mind will keep trying to reactivate the cycles, but every time you choose to see without anticipating, something opens. The field feels it and responds with new forms, finer experiences, connections that would never arise under the eyes of the old observer. The broken observer's loop is not a concept. It is a change of state. It is the moment when consciousness takes the place of automatic thought, when you stop using your gaze as defense and begin to use it as presence. To see in this state is to allow the invisible to also see you, to let the field hear your intention without words, to allow reality for the first time to feel free to surprise you. If you've made it this far, write in the comments, I am seeing new. This shows that your consciousness is present and that the old cycle no longer dominates you. And of course, if this content moved you, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. There's much more coming, and you'll want to be around when the next turning point arrives.